if you're going to be a serious post-liberal, you need to become a Maoist. And of course, that fails as well, obviously. But, I would like to see that degree of honesty from post-liberals. Say, okay, you want to really get rid of the PMC? You're going back to the fields, buddy. And so am I, and so are you. Are you happy with this? Right? No, you're not. So
get some fresh air.
I thought of that with some of these posts where, for some reason, it's always that video of the Gen Z Boston a mini thing. Where
yes.
Did you all do a video? I think you might have done an episode discussing that or something. But
no, we certainly did. Okay. I'm sorry, we are a more serious podcast.
No, but you might have
dedicate an episode to that.
Sorry.
But we certainly have mentioned it. Yeah.
So sorry but I remember some video like after the stocks crashed with the tariffs, where there was some viral right-wing post that was like, an image of like the stocks crashing and then an image of that still from that video, and it was like, I'm totally fine with this if it destroys these people or something. I did think here about like Mao and Pol Pot here, that, sort of, we need to actually just like the true sort of radical MAGA program would be, no, we need to like bring society back to the Stone Age just to defang or these sort of PMC, girl boss tyrants.
I want Pete Hegseth tweeting, we're going to bomb ourselves back to the Stone Age.
Right, exactly.
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello, it's Monday the 13th of April. This is the Bunga Cast Reading Club. The date is potentially an auspicious one, particularly for what we're about to be discussing. And we're going to be discussing, in a sort of way, liberalism and post-liberalism. Is today some sort of landmark date in post-liberalism or post-post-liberalism, as Orban and his party have been routed in Hungarian elections, and this quite small Central European country, which has been the center of world affairs for a decade, or at least for politics podcasts like these, maybe now no longer is. Now it's back in the liberal technocratic fold. That's a potential misreading of the Hungarian election, a deliberate misreading of the Hungarian election, which we will get onto, I think, in a separate episode. So I'm not going to say any more about that. Actually, I will say hello, I'm Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil. Got George Hoare in London as usual. Hello, George.
Hey.
And for this special reading club, we have a guest in, Geoff Shullenberger, big friend of the pod. At least we consider him a friend of the pod. I don't know if Geoff considers himself a friend.
Don't put him on the spot like that.
He doesn't have to answer.
Are you my friend?
Look, we like you, Geoff. I don't know if you like us, but Geoff is.
I'm honored to be a friend of the pod.
Excellent.
Glad to make that official.
Okay, no, good. So Geoff Shullenberger, friend of the pod and managing editor at Compact magazine, and a very intelligent fellow who are happy to be talking about post-liberalism. Now, you, regular listener to the BungaCast Reading Club, will know that we have 5 kind of central themes which are guiding our whole programming over the course of the year, and indeed potentially beyond. What we're going to be talking about here specifically touches on, I think, 2 different themes. One is irrationalism and unfreedom, which is our concern with the forms of counter-enlightenment thought today and what political forms they take, as well as political recombination. What revolts are going on against the established order? What do the new ideologies emerging today look like? Are they thin ideologies? And I suspect the answer to that is yes. Just on thin ideologies, we talked about that, I think, in the first reading club of this year, which was on illiberalism. Today we're talking about post-liberalism, and we may get on to talking about why or how they relate to each other, which one's a good term, if we want to jettison one or the other, I don't know. But the point about illiberalism, or the argument advanced by the author of that piece, is that, in a way, the world is populated by thin ideologies today, which don't really seek to provide answers across the board on social, political, economic, philosophical issues. In fact, they tend to be more constrained and more reactive. And this might be something useful to bear in mind as we go forward today. just one. Well, I'm just going to introduce the pieces before we kind of get started, and we all can discuss the pieces themselves. It's two essays that we're discussing today. The first is John Gray, Why I Am Not a Post-Liberal, which is from the New Statesman from October 2025. I thought this was, John Gray is always interesting, always self-contradictory, always very wrong. I mean, just to get my position on John Gray out of the way, self-contradictory often within the space of a few paragraphs, but nevertheless, he always is thought-provoking. And of course, as a former Thatcherite turned some sort of nihilist, turned post-liberal, turned now not post-liberal, and indeed Hobbesian liberal, as he describes himself in the essay, his sort of peripatetic course through the ideologies of the late 20th and early 21st century, I guess, is maybe interesting, instructive, worth discussing at any rate. John Gray, in this piece, just to set it up, he starts off by referring to Alasdair MacIntyre, the philosopher, former Marxist, then Catholic, Aristotelian, etc. We're going to get onto that in a bit. But John Gray basically says, look, the world is a world of hyper-individualism, rather, and that leads to this desire for self-realization, which leads to a need for meaning or belonging, which generates communitarianism. Now, John Gray, as a liberal, is against communitarianism. He's worried about identity politics generating kind of all these closed off little blocks in society. And instead, what we need is neither some sort of restoration of a past communitarian wholeness or integral communities. And what we need instead is a kind of strong Hobbesian state which guarantees individuals' right to exist within the national space. Something like that. And Geoff and George can maybe correct my interpretation if they feel that I've misconstrued it. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because he starts off by referring to Alasdair MacIntyre, who he had a meeting with, and characterizes MacIntyre's politics and philosophy in a particular way. And this, I thought, would be an opportunity to bring together, with the John Gray piece, an old Alasdair MacIntyre piece, which is intriguing for the very obvious reason that it's called The End of History and the End of the End of History. That's obviously of interest to us. And it's especially interesting because it was published in 1971. And it was actually reprinted by Church Life Journal, which is where I found it in May 2025. Of course, I'm an avid reader of Church Life Journal, long-time subscriber, one-time editor of I have no idea what the fuck this, I think it's published by Notre Dame University or something. Anyway, I'm not really sure what Church Life Journal is or what its interest in this essay is, other than the fact that MacIntyre was a Catholic. But it's interesting because, of course, he's talking about the end of history in 1971 and referring not to the Fukuyaman 1990s end of history, but to the 1950s end of history, or as he talks about it, the end of ideology. Now, in our book, The End of History, we talk about this ourselves as one of the end of histories that have happened in the past, and that there was this big concern with political apathy in the 1950s. Indeed, one very similar, it seemed, to the concerns voiced in the 1990s, and especially, I think, in the 2000s. So MacIntyre goes and looks at these end of ideology theorists from the 1950s, Daniel Bell, I can never get his name.
Seymour Martin Lipset.
Yeah, I managed to always just do some weird combination. I get Lipset. I'm like,
it's one of those
Seymour,
great
Lipset, Lipset. Yeah,
it's one of those great mid-century, three-part tripartite names.
Yeah, you don't get them anymore.
I know. You just can't be you can't be a Zoomer named Seymour Martin Lipset. I mean, I don't think named Seymour anymore. Anyway, sorry.
I think tripartite names have been just for serial killers nowadays. So it's kind of the brand has been broken.
George Hoare has a good piece on serial killers in Damage magazine from maybe a year ago, which listeners should check out. Let me give a reference to that. It just reminded me of that. Anyway, so MacIntyre's critique, indeed, along similar lines to ours. And in fact, when we wrote our book, I wasn't aware of this MacIntyre essay, but, basically goes, the post-ideology of the 1950s is itself an ideology, right? And the sort of anti-ideological 1950s birthed necessarily the kind of 1960s revolt, and but the romantic revolt of the 1960s. Lots of stuff to dig into there, which we're going to come on to. So I'll stop talking and pass over to George.
Yeah, thanks. No, very, very helpful summary and introduction. And I guess the first question is just to pick up on essentially the last point that you made then to start with the MacIntyre. So he, yeah, as you said, in writing in 1971, he wasn't referring to the future, to the Fukuyaman end of history in the 1990s, but as you said, going back to the 50s, and these various end of ideology claims. So I guess, was he right that all of these claims about the end of ideology made in the 50s through Daniel Bell was not a tripartite name haver who made these sorts of claims, but he did also make these claims. And he sort of says, these are you never get more ideological than when saying this is the end of ideology. Was he right? Or had ideology actually died by the 1950s?
I'm going to let Geoff answer, but I just want to say how Žižekian that is. And I just realized Žižek's stolen that. But anyway, Geoff.
Yeah, that's right. So that was my thought as well. This famous Žižek. I believe the riff that he's repeated the most is the one about toilets. Is that right? That precisely at the moment when you think you're past ideology, it's still instantiated in the design of your toilets. So that's sort of the Žižekian version of a particular Marxian account of ideology, in which ideology is precisely not which you explicitly articulate as your ideology, but some kind of deeper set of assumptions, some kind of common sense underlying it, rather than some kind of explicit articulate account of the world and how you should act in it. So McIntyre, in his own way, sort of going through Bell and Lipset, essentially tries to show that what they regard as a post-ideological condition is in fact an ideological condition, and then that the vulnerabilities of that supposedly kind of final steady state were ultimately shown by the new left, various kinds of new left revolts against it, as I read this article. So the question, was is he right? Just to repeat the question, was it, were Bell and Lipset right in some sense that ideology had died? I mean, in a certain sense, I think we could say it all depends on which definition of ideology we want to use. But I think we can say that a sort of tacit common sense had established itself in that era about what the limits and possibilities of political action were, individually and collectively, and that there was a broad kind of consensus beyond which people were not generally attempting to venture. And in the context of the United States, this partly had to do, I think, with the way that the Republican Party under Eisenhower made peace with the New Deal order, with the much larger administrative state, with a certain, at least limited version of the welfare state, a certain sort of commitment to state planning in as having a role in the economy, some kind of state coordination of the economy. So all these things were taken out of a cross-partisan consensus, but also just informed what people took to be possible and conceivable within the political order. So in that sense, I think, I made a kind of snide remark about somebody who I thought said something kind of dumb the other day on Substack, which was, but they pointed out something interesting, which is that supposedly, I didn't check whether this is actually true, but when Milton Friedman published Capitalism and Freedom in, I believe, 1962, it didn't get any reviews in the mainstream press. So, the claim that this person, who I assume is some kind of sort of right liberal libertarian, was saying, the mainstream press has always been biased and refuses to engage with this kind of stuff. I mean, I suppose that's true, but I think in that specific context, part of the point was that somebody like Friedman, the sort of laissez-faire ideology that he, and this would have been considered within the Bell framework an ideology in the sense of a kind of, a radical and extreme set of positions that I think for somebody like Bell would have been sort of disproven by historical events. And that if you hold on to those commitments to laissez-faire, then you're an ideologue in the bad sense. And And so that's, one kind of negative version of ideology, where ideology is a kind of irrational commitment to some sort of dogma that's been disproven. I think for Bell, that would be on one hand laissez-faire liberalism, and on the other hand, Soviet Marxism, Soviet communism, and sort of utopianism. So that's one version of the post-ideological would be, we've arrived at a consensus and a framework whereby we can explicitly identify previous political projects and programs that simply don't work, that we've proven don't work, and that we can therefore discard on, more or less scientific grounds.
Mm.
So that's, I suppose, one version of how I think, they had at least a case to make that, we had learned certain things in the course of the history of the 19th and 20th centuries, and those had allowed us to simply rule out certain ways of thinking. Now, of course, they were, obviously they were sort of premature in arriving to this conclusion. I think the fact that they could just kind of regard someone like Friedman as a crank, and of course he then goes on to be a quite influential figure and win a Nobel Prize and so on, is a good illustration of maybe how they were blind to the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in their own positions.
Yeah.
Alex, what about, I kind of want to put the question to you, but in a slightly not spicier way, but given that you've got form of talking about the end of history, do you think you would have, the 1950s would have felt like the end of history or the end of ideology or something? Do you think you would have said in the 1950s, if you were alive, this is the end of ideology?
Yes, probably, in some hypothetical way where I'm a communist, which I've always aspired to. That's always been my greatest political aspiration, to be able to call myself a communist.
You can call yourself a communist.
No, you can't. Yeah, but I also take myself, I have some sense of accountability and seriousness, however small, and therefore don't allow myself to just adopt silly labels like communist, which has no meaning in 2026 or even in late 1990s or something, when I was a teenager or whatever. Anyway, I think the point about
which 2010s like lefty Twitter influencer had some line about, I am literally, was it Ash Sarkar?
I'm literally a communist. Yeah, and I think she meant literally an anarchist, and also even there, not too much of one.
So you're saying you're literally not a communist, which is maybe as bad.
Yeah, but I think the point about there's a kind of element of retconning here when you go through this question of at the end of histories, right? So in a sense, they were correct in the 1950s, but then you go, well, but the 1960s happened shortly after that. And of course you have this, this romantic revolt, let alone a lot of labor militancy around the world. And history is back then, or ideology is back. And then you go, well, you take things forward and you say, well, no, history really ended anyway in 1989, and so the 1950 was premature. And then you look at all that's happened since, and the end of history, the end of the Fukuyaman end of history, and where we are now, and the fact that politics has returned, but without any new emancipatory ideology on the horizon whatsoever. And you think we're in a kind of very messy political situation, maybe in some ways akin to the 19th century, but without the shadow of the Enlightenment behind us. And you are left to conclude that, yes, history did end at the end of the Second World War, but in a specific sense of putting an end to communism as a possibility. Socialism, particularly as state socialism or barrack socialism, or however you wish to characterize it, continued as a going possibility through the Cold War. But communism, particularly understood as a kind of non-state, or leading towards some sort of non-state state, was ended with, fascism won. Right? Fascism won. And so in that regard, yeah, the 1950s really did represent the end of ideology, understood in the kind of deepest possible sense of what alternative possibilities were. And maybe it takes until now, or it takes until the kind of the Fukuyaman end of history to recognize the real depth of the Lipset Bell end of history of the 1950s.
Yeah, I think it, coming immediately after the second, well, not immediately, but coming soon after the Second World War, the very structure of ideological conflict would have felt very, very different in the 50s. And yeah, I do appreciate, hypothetically talking about what you'd have done in the 50s, is not always the most useful question. So maybe to move on to McIntyre himself, because I guess all of this is to a certain extent the context of this essay, but also for one of the thinkers who might come to mind as one of the earliest potential post-liberals, and this is Alasdair MacIntyre. This kind of combination of Marxism and Catholicism, kind of developing his thought in the wake of the defeat of the New Left, and bringing in perhaps after virtue as well, which is later than this essay that he wrote. Is MacIntyre, is it a credible label to call MacIntyre a post-liberal? Is that the right way to characterize his I guess his overall position?
I mean, it's certainly anti-liberal. I don't know if he's post-liberal, because post suggests going through, and the combination. And I mean, I don't know to what extent people feel that he was able to realize a synthesis in some ways of Marxism and Catholicism, or if these were different passages in his career. But really, that Marxism plus Catholicism is a real 1-2 punch on liberal individualism, right? I mean, if we're thinking of this kind of maybe morphologically, sort of, I don't know, or just or just sort of on a very simple spectrum, that you basically have two conceptions of ideology, but even just of being, of what the subject is, etc., which are both radically anti-individualist in albeit in very different ways, and combined they I guess they are anti-liberal. So whether MacIntyre was an early post-liberal, I suppose insofar as he was new leftist, and I mean that he was a critical new leftist, but he was engaged in the debates of the new left while he was a Marxist in the 1960s, and in that regard necessarily had an element of liberalism to it, in terms of those debates often concerning the role and the situation of the individual subject and so on, and that there's a disappointment with the new left in MacIntyre's case and many others, of course, and that the kind of virtue ethics that he develops is premised on a kind of communitarian notion, or kind of, I guess a communitarian notion of how to situate the human being, which expresses a extremely deep critique of modernity, right? Not just of the 1960s or of the 20th century or indeed of the 19th century. I mean, he goes way back, and if you take him seriously and you take what he argues in After Virtue, for example, seriously, he forces us to kind of rethink what we think about the Enlightenment, even us Marxists or us liberals, going way back. In some ways, our whole moral conception was already fallen by the time the Enlightenment comes around. So is he post-liberal? Yeah, but I mean, maybe well beyond what any other post-liberal thinker could be classed as.
He's not the only communitarian, though. I mean, Charles Taylor, you would add to that list, or in that ballpark, surely.
So the person I was thinking of in parallel to MacIntyre, who I bring up in part because, like MacIntyre, he's proven influential in circles of people who describe themselves as post-liberal, or at least sympathetic to post-liberalism as a project, is Christopher Lasch, who has a somewhat parallel career, albeit as a historian rather than a philosopher. And I say parallel because they both are people who are sympathetic to aspects of the New Left critique of essentially the Bell Lipset sort of liberal technocratic consensus. Both of them are interested in the Frankfurt School critique of the totally administered society. I actually pulled down off my shelf an early text by MacIntyre on Herbert Marcuse. So he wrote a short book in 1970 about Herbert Marcuse, which is an interesting read. I won't go into it, but the point is, and he's critical, he's critical of Marcuse in a number of ways, but nonetheless, he's interested in the Frankfurt School critique of, precisely the settlement that Bell and Lipset are defending, as is Lasch. Lasch is, interestingly, he becomes a sort of fervent critic of Cold War liberalism, as it's been called recently by Samuel Moyn. And so he and McIntyre are both sort of somewhat sympathetic fellow travelers of the New Left. And there are a few other people we could put in this category. Maybe the most full-on New Left figure who then also has a kind of turn to the right is another historian and colleague of Lasch, Eugene Genovese. So without going into that too much, there are these figures who I think go through the New Left, and maybe that might be a reason not to think of them as post-liberals, because they're sort of always quite critical of mainstream liberalism as it defines itself in that era. And then they like McIntyre, Lasch is somebody who kind of tries to dig back deeper into history to find forgotten traditions that might be drawn upon to articulate a different political vision. So Lasch doesn't go back as far as McIntyre. He goes back really to the American tradition of agrarian populism, as well as sort of the American Republican tradition, sort of small r Republican, sort of Jeffersonian democracy and ideas like that. And so he's interested in trying to resuscitate, and this is a version of this communalism, that there is a kind of revival of neo-communalist ideas in this era. There are other people we could bring into the conversation here, but who are not necessarily, some are actually explicitly quite left-wing figures who are thinking in these terms. But it does seem to me that the most important works by both Lasch and McIntyre come in this interregnum between, before sort of before the Fukuyaman end of history, before the full rise of neoliberalism. After Virtue is 1981, so it comes right around the Reagan-Thatcher turn. Similarly, Lasch's most important works, Culture of Narcissism, is 79, I believe. Then Minimal Self is 82 or 83. And so, it's kind of in the same period when the mid-century consensus of Bell and Lipset was sort of obviously in crisis and had fallen apart. That's very explicit in the opening of Culture of Narcissism. And so you have these people who are trying to figure out what new coordinates for politics can be found. And so, I think you can call it post-liberal in a certain sense because they're coming after this particular moment of liberal hegemony under, the Bell-Lipset consensus. But, there are also ways we might not want to call them post-liberals because they're not, that they're people who have always kind of positioned themselves outside of and in confrontation to liberalism.
But that's really good, and it's really intriguing because I had thought about Lasch in that regard quite explicitly in terms of post-New Left and this period before the rise of neoliberalism, but I hadn't thought of McIntyre in the kind of same breath. And putting it all together, they're dealing in a way with the crisis of the Keynesian Fordist society, post-war order, etc., and the failure of the New Left to really overturn it. And it kind of does provoke the thought, I mean, maybe an idle thought because it's kind of completely counterfactual, but it's like if neoliberalism hadn't been successful, the neoliberal counter-revolution hadn't come in with such force and if things had kind of trundled along, stagnating for longer through the 1980s, particularly in the US and Britain, because those are the two countries where neoliberalism comes in with at least in the capitalist core, comes in with the greatest force and overturns the kind of post-war order. If that kind of trundled on longer, maybe there would have been might have generated a politics, right? Like there might have been a Lasch, McIntyre, etc. politics which had been generated, which would have been provided a sort of a political answer of some sort to the collapse of the post-war order, which was not the neoliberal one. Because once neoliberalism comes in, that becomes the question of the day, and the questions posed by Lasch and McIntyre become, I mean, they don't become redundant or they don't become passé, but they become kind of forgotten in the face of the neoliberal onslaught. So it's kind of, there's maybe a path not taken there, which
would that path be communitarianism? I mean, I know that it's not unproblematic to say that McIntyre was a communitarian because in Dependent Rational Animals, he's clear that communitarians make the mistake to infuse the politics of the state with the politics of like the community. That's not, I mean, but is that the path not taken?
Well, because it would have been an answer to welfare state bureaucracy, which was not the neoliberal one. right? I think fundamentally, the sense of stagnation, the lack of vitality, the kind of, I don't know, civil society which was already already perhaps kind of shredding, and that this provides some vision of revivifying civil society before the neoliberals came and assaulted the welfare state, assaulted the material conditions on which the previously existing civil society still existed, right? I guess that's what I mean by it.
Before the civil society was totally decayed and shredded, there was maybe a point it could have been saved. The patient could have been.
Yeah, or there might have been a politics. It would have been a kind of centrist, but I guess, I don't know where that politics would have.
Well, I want to. I'll make a provocative claim here, which is on my mind because I've been researching and writing about this. But in the 90s, in a way, and if you read Fred Turner's From Counterculture to Cyberculture, he describes the original consensus of Silicon Valley that is kind of popularized through things like Wired Magazine as neo-communalist. So it's not quite communitarian, but it is essentially, and there are ways you can see this as a new sort of cross-partisan consensus that begins to take shape, because you have, obviously all kinds of left-wing ideas about the internet, revitalizing kind of, horizontal communities and kind of self-organizing free communities, while also, both allowing the individual to liberate himself from, the oppressive kind of local conditions in which he might find himself, but also to merge into new communities. And so this is a very positive, common positive program around network technologies in this era. And then you have a version of it on the right, where you have Newt Gingrich and this thing called the Progress and Freedom Society, that's sort of an attempt to create a sort of symbiosis between the Republican Party and the tech industry, where you really get this idea that the internet will revitalize kind of Tocquevillian kind of a Tocquevillian culture of association, and of sort of, of a new form of kind of digital civil society. So I think in some ways we could argue that some of these aspirations do actually get channeled in the, particularly in the 90s sort of neoliberal era, into these ideas about technology. That is, and so they don't become in a sense, they become, we could say they become a political project in that both parties attempt to kind of channel and represent that in different ways, but at least in the United States. But I think it also becomes a kind of anti-political or post-political project, because there's a way that it's really that technology is somehow seen as superseding politics as a mode of organizing people or allowing people to self-organize.
Yeah, that's great. I like that, because it's not laying the pre-political substrate, right, of kind of communal organizations or something which might then lead into political activity. It's circumventing politics altogether. I like that. I mean, I like it. I don't like it, but it's cool to bring that to light. Can I just make one quick observation also about McIntyre before we move on to Gray, and indeed the kind of relationship between the two, which is something which also stood out to me, which I thought, I've read this somewhere before, but much after 1971 when McIntyre wrote this, which is basically McIntyre says, well, there's a politics of those within, and then there's a politics of those without. And the cost of the consensus politics of the 1950s is exclusion, right? And so that the end of ideology of Bell and Lipset is a politics, but it's a politics of those within, of those included. And he mentioned the kind of racial question in the United States as the kind of fundamental fracture in the US, and that indeed would have been the case there. But one can think of other cases in other times and places. But it reminded me of Rancière, and like that's basically Rancière's case against the consensus democracy of the 90s and 2000s, right? And which indeed Zizek himself, then takes on. So I think that's the root why we find this so similar to kind of some Zizek stuff, even though he's writing this in 1971, which is like, for Rancière, like real genuine politics and not just administration is in some sense the entrance of a new subject of the excluded into, and which kind of makes claims upon society as a whole, then I guess he's thinking along similar lines to McIntyre, that the end of ideology stuff is a kind of non-political politics, which and the cost of that, maintaining that kind of consensus society, is precisely the exclusion and exclusion of these other subjects. Anyway, it's just kind of interesting to think about to think about how McIntyre's thinking along these lines, and then like Rancière comes along in a different context and kind of has a similar interpretation of post ideology.
For McIntyre, what would the subjects being excluded be?
I mean, Black Americans. I mean, I think he's explicit. In
that piece, he does raise that as sort of the fundamental contradiction of the liberal, the sort of liberal end of ideology consensus.
And I think that's the Irish in Britain before then, in another era, but.
Which I think is in some ways, I'd say his account of it is a bit oversimplified in the sense that, throughout this era, there is this contradiction is working itself out in all sorts of ways, and it's partly a contradiction of the New Deal electoral coalition, the fact that it is built on the South, which, for complicated kind of sort of accidental coalitional reasons is integrated with this kind of Northern liberal project, even though they're deeply at odds with each other on certain points. And so, I think he's channeling a very kind of new left view there, actually, that this order is defined by its kind of exclusion of Black Americans. And you hear this from, contemporary kind of left-wing people that like, oh, the New Deal excluded Black people from its benefits. And so it was never really good in the first place. It was always racist. I mean, this is kind of a common new left trope that you still hear today as a reason why, we shouldn't actually look back to this as a good example of like successful progressive politics. So anyway, it's interesting to hear him. But yeah, I mean, I think he's certainly raising an important point that continues to have value, but it's interesting that in some sense he has to kind of oversimplify the history of the period in order to make that claim.
Hello friend, you've reached the end of the free part of the episode. Well, we put out 2 entirely free episodes a month. The rest is for subscribers. For access, please join us at patreon.com/bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive episodes with the entirety of the BungaCast cast. That's George Hoare, myself Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors Philip Cunliffe, Lee Jones, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Alex Gurevich, Ryan Zickgraf, and Lee Phillips, as well as a huge number of guests. In 2026, our priorities are to explore the following themes: emerging state capitalism, war and militarism, political recombinations and new revolts, irrationalism and unfreedom and how to challenge these ideas, and the pre-political, or the social bases on which politics may be built. We'll also be exploring these themes through the BungaCast Reading Club, through a selection of classic essays, book chapters, films, and academic articles. If you sense history accelerating but feel that we have no control over events, then join us as we try to find political clarity to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.